The house felt different at night. Not louder, not darker, just heavier. Like the walls were holding their breath. I couldn't sleep. I hadn't been able to for weeks. My husband lay beside me, turned away, his back a quiet declaration of distance. We used to talk at night. Now we shared silence like an obligation. I slipped out of bed and moved down the hallway barefoot, careful not to make a sound. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m. Too late to be awake. Too late to think clearly. That's when I saw him. He was sleeping on the couch, one arm hanging loosely at his side, the soft rise and fall of his chest steady and calm. He was visiting for a few weeks, my husband's adult son from his first marriage. 24. Independent. A grown man who lived his own life far away from this house. And yet, seeing him there made my chest tighten. I told myself it was nothing. Just surprise. Just concern. Anyone would pause, I thought. Anyone would notice. I stood there longer than I should have. The lamp near the window cast a dim glow across his face. He looked younger when he slept, unguarded, unaware. Not inviting. Not asking for anything. And somehow that made it worse. This is wrong, my mind whispered immediately. I turned to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I sat down on the edge of the opposite chair, far enough to tell myself I was still doing the right thing. I folded my hands in my lap, my fingers cold despite the warm room. I thought about my marriage. About how my husband no longer looked at me the way he used to. About conversations that ended before they began. About feeling invisible in my own home. I hated myself for making comparisons. He shifted slightly in his sleep, murmuring something I couldn't understand. My heart jumped, sharp and sudden. For a brief second, I was terrified he would wake up and see me there, watching. But he didn't, and instead of relief, I felt something worse. Awareness. I was aware of how quiet the house was. Aware of how fast my thoughts were moving. Aware of a line forming clearly in my mind, and how close I was standing to it. I told myself I was just making sure he was comfortable. That I'd leave in a moment. That this meant nothing. But deep down, I knew better. Because the betrayal didn't begin with touch. It began with permission, and when I finally stood up to go back to bed, I realized the truth that would haunt me long after that night. I hadn't woken him, but I hadn't walked away when I should have either. If you're ready, I can continue with part 2, where temptation grows and restraint starts to crack. I avoided him the next morning. Not obviously, not in a way anyone else would notice. I was careful, too careful. I stayed busy in the kitchen, kept my back turned when he walked into the room, answered him politely but briefly when he spoke. But avoidance has a strange way of sharpening awareness instead of dulling it. I noticed everything anyway. The sound of his footsteps. The way his voice had changed since the last time I'd seen him, lower, steadier. The ease with which he moved through the house, like it still belonged to him, even after all these years. My husband didn't notice a thing. He rarely did anymore. That afternoon, the house emptied out. My husband left for work. Errands, meetings, excuses, I wasn't sure anymore. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed longer than it should have. And suddenly, it was just the two of us. I told myself to keep my distance. To stay in separate rooms. To let the day pass quietly. Instead, we ended up in the living room. Not intentionally, not planned. Just two people drawn into the same space by coincidence and comfort. He sat on one end of the couch, scrolling on his phone. I sat on the other, pretending to read. The silence between us wasn't empty. It felt charged, stretched thin like a wire pulled too tight. "You didn't sleep well last night," he said suddenly, without looking up. My breath caught. "What makes you think that?" He glanced at me then, just briefly. "You look tired." That was all. Harmless. Observant. And yet it felt like he had seen something I'd tried to hide. I nodded and looked back at my book, the words blurring on the page. "Yeah. Just one of those nights." He hesitated, then spoke again. "I do that too. When I'm here." I looked at him this time. He wasn't smiling. His expression was thoughtful, almost cautious, like he hadn't meant to say that out loud. The conversation should have ended there. But it didn't. We talked, About small things at first. His work, his plans. How strange it felt to be back in a place that held memories he didn't know what to do with anymore. I listened more than I spoke, surprised by how easily the time passed. At some point, I realized we had both shifted closer without noticing. Not touching, not yet, but closer. Every instinct told me to stand up, to end it, to create distance before something irreversible happened. And for a moment, I almost did. Then he laughed softly at something I said, and the sound settled somewhere deep in my chest. That was when I understood the truth I didn't want to face. The danger wasn't that something might happen. The danger was that part of me had already decided it wouldn't be unwelcome. And as the afternoon light faded and the room grew dim, I wondered, not for the first time, but more honestly than ever. How long could I keep pretending this was nothing, when it was already becoming everything I was trying not to want? When you're ready, I can continue with part 3, where restraint weakens and the emotional line finally breaks. It started with avoidance again. Not because I wanted distance this time, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't create it. I kept busy, found reasons to be in other rooms, told myself that control was still mine if I acted early enough. But control is fragile when it's built on denial. That evening, the power went out. Just for a while, long enough for the house to fall into a quiet I wasn't prepared for. No television, no distractions, only shadows and the sound of the wind brushing against the windows. He came into the kitchen while I was lighting a candle. For light, I said quickly, as if explaining myself mattered. For company, he replied, softer. I didn't answer. We stood there, the flame flickering between us, casting unsteady shapes across the walls. In the half-light, everything felt less defined, rules included. I think we've been pretending, he said after a moment. My heart slammed against my ribs. Pretending what? That this is normal. He didn't step closer, but his voice did. That we don't feel this tension. I should have shut it down. Should have said his name sharply, reminded him who I was, where the line was. Instead, I whispered, we shouldn't be talking about this. I know, he said immediately. No argument, no pressure, but pretending it's not there doesn't make it disappear. The honesty in his voice undid me more than anything else could have. I turned away, gripping the counter, trying to steady myself. My reflection in the dark window looked unfamiliar, someone standing on the edge of a choice she'd never imagined making. This can't happen, I said, more to myself than to him. I'm not asking it to, he replied. I just don't want to lie about it anymore. Silence stretched between us again, but this time, it felt deliberate. I became acutely aware of how close he was. Not touching, still careful, but close enough that I could feel warmth where the air had been cool before. Every reason I had rehearsed dissolved under the weight of the moment. Guilt, loyalty, consequences, they were all still there, but quieter now, drowned out by something louder. Recognition. I turned back toward him, slowly. Our eyes met, and the question hung between us, unspoken but unmistakable. When I reached out, it wasn't reckless. It wasn't desperate. It was deliberate. My fingers brushed his arm, just briefly. A test. A confirmation. The smallest contact, yet it felt like crossing a bridge that couldn't be uncrossed. He didn't move away. That was the moment I knew. The betrayal wasn't waiting in the future anymore. It wasn't hypothetical. It was standing right there with us, breathing in the same quiet space. And as the candle flickered and the darkness pressed closer, I realized something that made my chest ache. Even if nothing more happened after this, I had already gone too far to pretend I was still the same person I'd been before. Whenever you're ready, I can continue with part 4, where consequences, guilt, and unresolved aftermath collide, and leave the story hanging where it hurts most. The power came back on without ceremony. One moment the house was wrapped in shadow and flickering light, the next it was normal again, bright, ordinary, unforgiving. The spell broke instantly. We stepped apart as if the space between us had always been there. He cleared his throat. I blew out the candle. Neither of us said anything. That silence felt heavier than all the words we had avoided before. It was filled with everything we'd almost done, everything we'd admitted without saying it out loud. I should go, he said finally. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. He hesitated, like he wanted to say more, then thought better of it. When he left the room, his footsteps faded slowly, deliberately, until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stood there long after he was gone. Nothing had happened, and yet, everything had. That night, I lay beside my husband again, staring at the ceiling. He reached for me in his sleep, his hand resting on my arm like it used to. I didn't move. Guilt doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in quietly, like dust you don't notice until it coats everything. I replayed the evening over and over, the candlelight, the honesty in his voice, the moment my hand had touched his arm. Such a small thing, so easy to explain away if I wanted to lie to myself. But I didn't, because the truth was unbearable in its simplicity. I had wanted something I shouldn't have wanted, and I had let myself want it. The next morning, the house felt different again. Too bright, too exposed. We avoided each other instinctively this time, moving through separate rooms, separate thoughts. When our eyes met across the kitchen, there was no tension, only understanding. An agreement without words. This was the dangerous part, I realized. Not the moment itself, but what came after. The knowledge, the memory, the possibility that lingered quietly between us. He was leaving in a few days. That should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like a countdown. I caught my reflection in the mirror as I passed the hallway, the same hallway where this all began. I looked unchanged, ordinary, respectable, but I knew better. Infidelity doesn't always leave marks that others can see. Sometimes it lives entirely inside you, reshaping the way you look at yourself, at your choices, at the people you love. As I stood there, listening to the familiar sounds of my home, one question echoed louder than any other. Was this a single mistake I could bury and forget? Or had I crossed a line that would quietly follow me, even after he was gone? The answer didn't come, and that uncertainty, the not knowing, was the punishment I carried with me long after the night had passed. If you want, I can now write a title, description, and hashtags. Create visual prompts for each part. Or rewrite this as a shorter, punchier YouTube script. Just tell me thumbs up.